morning and good evening and good afternoon, everyone, wherever you come from. Welcome to today's special book launch of this book. Okay, I'm holding in my hands, okay, passionate work by Dr. Renyi Hong of CNM. So my dear colleague, I cannot be more excited, okay, to I got this book several months ago, and we've been looking forward to have today's event that's talking about the conditions of subjectivity, okay, making and also looking at the management discourses, gamification, and co-work spaces. Okay, a lot of exciting phenomena that are impacting on every one of us, especially if you are young and upcoming professional, right? And so the way we will proceed is to ask Renyi to introduce the book, okay, briefly. And then we are really thrilled to have Professor Tom Streeter from the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, Western University in Ontario, Canada, to join us. Tom probably also needs no introduction. He's a very renowned media scholar and sociologist. And those of you who have taken my modules, I think Renyi also, okay, we used, and our students love Tom's article about Steve Jobs and romantic individualism, right? So I think there's also lots of, for those of the students who have read that article, I think it also can prepare you to read this book, right? And of course, most importantly, this book just came out from Duke University Press a few months ago, and you can buy it either the hard copy, okay, or the soft copy online if you go to Amazon, okay, .com or .sg, right? So after Professor Tom Streeter's comments, right, we will open up the floor for Q&A. Thanks everyone for coming. Over to you, Renyi.
Thank you. Just let me do a share. Okay, give me a moment. Okay. Hi, everybody. Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction, Jack. Really appreciate both you and Tom for being here today, serving as both moderator and discussant. For those who don't know, Jack and Tom are, of course, big figures in our field of communication. Jack has been working on labor for a long time, so his work is my go-to space when I think about my own work as well. Tom worked on technology and culture, and I've been following his work. The Net Effect is still my Bible to understanding the history of the internet. And his quote there, whether or not computers think, they are things that we think with, is something that I sort of plaster at the front of almost all my teaching slides. So thanks a lot, and very honored to have both of them here today. And of course, thanks also to everyone who's here, despite your time zone, and hope that we'll have a great discussion. So Passion Work is a book that really addresses the ways that passion coalesces and structures our social world. In this book, I go against the grain in thinking about one of the key ways that passion tends to be talked about, which is as an emotion, right? Something that you cultivate, that you feel, and you do something about. But my argument is that passion is not just something that you feel and you experience, but rather the world is built around passion, right? It's about supporting and pushing passion in different ways, such that we're all subject to it, whether or not we feel it. Now, when I started this project, I was interested in looking at the discourses of passion. So there were two main discourses around passion, and that they still happen today. The first is perhaps what I would think of as a more naive or perhaps idealist sort of thread, right? Where there's this, advice for you to follow your dreams, do what you want to do what you love, and then when you do what you love, money will come, right? So there is the kind of advice, right, that is sort of promulgated. And then there's a reaction to that advice, right? So the reaction usually comes as a way of saying that this whole thing is a sham, right? And this whole thing is dangerous advice, or there is exploitation. And the key argument usually is that you invest your passions only to have something taken out from you. Now, a lot of scholarly work has focused on that angle, and I consider that, I broadly describe that as what I call trade-off theory. And in this trade-off schematic, what happens is that you invest passion, love in your work, and then you lose something, and something gets away from you in return. So it could be money, it could be wages, it could be time, it could be commitments to other social projects, right? Whatever the case is, right, the emphasis is on the trade-off itself, the dynamic of you taking something, getting something away because of you investing your love into your work, right? And then, of course, this goes on to become a critique of capitalism, of what corporations do. But my argument, and as I sort of did my work, I noticed that this way of talking about passion is really insufficient. And it's insufficient in several ways. First, focusing on passion as an emotion really takes away from the ways that passion is used to structure the world, right? So one of my key arguments in the book is that passion is not just understood through its related positive emotions, like bliss, engagement, do what you love, but its absences, states like apathy, loneliness, boredom, and the fact that the negative states are often described as a crisis of work, right, is telling, because they point to the absence of what is deemed as the ideal of work itself, right, which is a passionate state. So this sort of explains the reason why I describe passion as an affective structure, right? Passion is an affective structure in different ways, right? So it's, first of all, it condenses a host of different emotional and cultural meanings, both positive and negative, as I explained, right? And it condenses those negativity, those negative states, partly because there's this whole idea sort of structured around it, right? Which is that if you can find the right job that is a right fit for you, that you will experience true passion, you will experience self-actualization, and it'll move you towards the good life, right? And I consider then passion as an effective structure for the second reason, which is because passionate work is stretched out into the social world, right? And it is recognized at different moments with different people in through different things, right? Creating many different kinds of association. So I sort of describe the ways passion can be built into infrastructure, into aesthetics, into policies. And so there really are different moments of recognition, and that people then engage in passion very differently. So a call center worker who is told to work on a gamified program so that they can be more engaged, right, is going to be engaged, you're going to be subject to have a very different understanding of passion compared to, say, someone in Singapore who wants to work at a co-working space because they feel that that space is more vibrant and will give them more energy, right? So there are all these different relationships to passion. But at the heart, again, passionate work maintains a central tenet and logic that determines how people relate to their work, right? So passionate work still is produced as this kind of ideal, right? That tells us that work can be fulfilling, right? And work can be something that we can invest our energy into, right? And as a promise, then it is very powerful, right? Because it's a very simple promise, right? It's a promise that work can be good and can be fulfilling, and that it then becomes and structures all of us in very different ways, right? I've talked about, given examples of how we may relate to passion, maybe say through gamified programs, through infrastructure, but it's also something that when we look at other people, we judge people by passion. So for instance, when you look at someone who's working on a dirty or repetitive kind of work, you may feel pity for them. And you may feel pity for them because you feel like they don't have access to the same idea of a dignified job or a good job that can evoke the kind of attachment that is sort of descriptive of passion, right? And so passion really not just glues people to things or to work, but glues people to each other, right? You go to people you are passionate with, in the same area, and you also judge people by their passions, right? So I started this project in a post-recessionary sort of phase, right? And that was, and this continues to be still a moment of relatively lot of disappointment about work, right? Retrenchments was high at a period of time, and there was this big sense of inequality, right? And people were just generally quite jaded about what work could do. And it was also at that moment I noticed that passion was doing something quite different, right? So the dominant critique of passion is that it is a cause for exploitation, right? Passion exploits you by taking away maybe something like wages when you invest your energies into your work. But what I found was people are also asked to follow their passions precisely because of the problems of the economy. So rather than just being a cause for exploitation, right, passion became a reaction to exploitation. And that this idea that passion holds together a broken and disappointed world, reattaching us to work at the point of failure, ended up being a very important part of materialization as to why passion is important for us to look at. And I guess this is why I really like Tetsuya Ishida's cover, right, or image that is on my cover, because it describes passion in the way I want to describe it. It's not necessarily an emotion that sort of has the kind of intense absorption that we associate passion with, but passion for me, at its baseline is an energetic emotion, right? What it is that it's an emotion that drives us forward, even at a time where we may feel tired or overwhelmed, right? And so my theory of passion is less characterized by inner desire, but something that keeps moving us along, all right? Endurance after the good life. So this approach really shaped the objects and subjects that I chose to analyze. I deliberately wanted to look at situations that did not conjure impressions of passion right off the bat and see what happens when passion gets pulled out into the social world, right? So sort of observe the fringes, okay? So in the first chapter, I look at managerial history. I study it from the 1920s to the 1970s, looking at people like Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, Elton Mayo. And what I noticed was this interesting trend, right? So in the 1920s to the 1950s, approximately, the dominant sort of emotional regime was happiness, right? It was all about leaders, industrial leaders, trying to produce this happy corporate family. But after the 1950s, you get this backlash, and happiness became this defective and pacifying emotion, right? So the critique often raised was that, happiness was just happy. You were just, cheerful. And happiness became something that's seen as synonymous with contentment. People who were happy were doing work, but they weren't interested to improve their work. And so at a period of time, then passion started to rise up as this dominant emotion. And the core part of this emotion, again, is activity, right? The idea that someone is invested in their work. And ironically, when passion came up, it opened up a different host of emotions because they realized that a passionate person is not always happy, but could be even angry, right, or disappointed. And so you have then all these range of emotions started to go into the logic of passion itself. And so what this sort of first chapter shows is that emotions are historically specific, right? And we are sort of charting a particular historical conjuncture. And then from then on, I move into sort of contemporary cases. And I study joblessness, right? And unemployment, apathy in chapter 2. I study boredom, call center work, gamification in chapter 3. And I look at co-working spaces, loneliness, and freelancing work in chapter 4. All right. And in all these cases, I keep asking myself this question, what forms does passion take? What does it do, right? And it turns out that passion can really come in all kinds of unexpected places. So in chapter 3, for instance, I talk about passion coming in from flow theory, which originates in World War II, right? So how trauma informs the impression and feelings of passion itself. So with the time that I have remaining, I thought of going a bit more into depth into one of my chapters, right? Chapter 2, okay, on unemployment. So I'm going to start this with a movie in 2009 at the height of the recession. So this was Up in the Air, a film played by George Clooney, who is playing the character Ryan Bingham, who is a professional downsizer. A professional downsizer is basically someone who goes around for different companies, firing people for a living, right? So he flies around and fires people. And Jason Reitman, who is the director of the film, tells us that this film was initially meant to be a satire about firing, right? It's meant to satirize the process of firing, and in the process, satirize also passion, right? Which is this hanky advice that's often delivered at the moment of firing. We see this early in the film. So in the film, just at the beginning, Bingham said someone who's going to be fired down and sort of delivers a phrase to him saying, what is that? Anyone who has ever built an empire or changed the world sat where you sat right now, and it's because they sat there, they were able to do it. Right. And the moment that employee looks placated, he seizes his key card, gets him out of the door, and then says, I'll never see him again. Right. And so, but that, however, becomes the only moment of satire that you see in the film, right? And Jason Reitman, in explaining this, said that we were in one of the worst recessions on record. So what started out as a story of a man who simply fired people for a living became a movie about a man who was trying to figure out who and what he wanted in his life. And in addition to that, I cut out all these kinds of satirical firing scenes that make sense when I first started writing the movie, but at this moment, that don't make sense. So then what made sense? To replace this, Reitman included vignettes of workers reenacting their reactions to being fired, right? And curiously, Reitman also explained that it was from these interviews that he sort of found his new path into his film, right? So he said that the loss of income rarely came up during those conversations. Rather, what people said time and time again was, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. It was really about a lack of purpose. Purpose, again, a word synonymous with passion, was thereby framed as not only something workers once had but lost, but it was also framed as a primary cause and the main crisis of the recession. So quite ironically, right, this film became about the recovery of purpose, right? So Bingham, the character, says to invest his life, his soul, and then this film becomes this feel-good film about finding one's direction amidst aimlessness, a pun on the word up in the air. But where passion may have once been raised as a cliche, its critique is now nullified through the acceptance of its necessity. Reitman is unwilling to mock passion because of its significance in molding a purposeful world and a good life. In fact, it is loss itself that makes a cliche of passion powerful and worth circulating, right? It is because of loss that Reitman becomes unwilling to mock passion. So I think, again, this is very important to understand then, because it really sort of says a lot about this this usefulness of passion, right, as a discursive structure. So now to better understand the context that will make this narrative possible, we probably then have to ask a very important question, which is, how did unemployment come to get such psychological significance, right? And we can begin the word employ, which is derived from the classical Latin verb implicare, which means also to entangle, involve, and connect closely. So on one level, employment is an entanglement, right? It's a contract with an employer established in return for often wages, right? But this idea of a connection in employment also hints at work's normative imbrication with the social world. So to be employed means to be used. It means to be made useful, right? And the in unemployment suggests a breaking of this connection, right? A lacuna that translates into other kinds of lack, right? So it starts with the ability to sustain yourself, then follows into one's social value and mental well-being. So the fear is not just of immediate loss, right? The severance of unemployment, of employment, but how that loss then gets connected to a series of breakages that eventually destroys the subject. So what I'm going to do here is to chart this history of the severance, building a link from unemployment as a circumstance to the unemployed as a subject and a population and a condition, long-term unemployment. So I began the story with Marienthal, a book published in German in 1933 and republished in English in 1971. Right, Marienthal is this sociological classic that has been described as foundational in social scientific understandings of unemployment. Right, any study of unemployment today probably has Marienthal as its foundation, and Marienthal is the title of the book, but it all references a real place. Right, so it is an Austrian industrial village that suffered complete unemployment in 1929, right? And so what is unusual about Marienthal is that it was a place where the whole village got laid off, all right, all of a sudden, right? And so it differs from most places where you have partial unemployment. And so Marie Jahoda, who is the writer of this book, sort of said that this is why Marienthal is this very useful microcosm to study. And then what is implied about it is this objective reality of unemployment as a transformative force, right? A condition there's an effect of people and things outside class and individual psychology. So the Marienthal narrative centers on the subject of prolonged unemployment and its influence on a breakdown on the social personality structure. So Paul Lazarsfeld, who is the second sociologist, the second writer of the book, right, tells us that the main thesis of Marienthal was about the state of apathy, in which victims do not even utilize any longer the few opportunities left to them, right? And he considers this a vicious cycle, right? That there is this vicious cycles between reduced opportunity and a reduced level of aspiration, and that eventually leads people into states of apathy. Now, I will sort of build on the discussion of apathy. But what is important to grasp at this point is how threatening the state of apathy is to capitalism, right? So Paul Lazarsfeld was sort of saying this during sort of massive unemployment in the 1970s, right? And if you look into the dictionary, you find that apathy is defined as inverse of passion, right? So one of the core definitions here is a passionless existence, okay? And the allusion of apathy in Lazarsfeld's sense to a affliction should draw attention to what is understood as psychologically normal. A person who is potentially impassioned, right? Someone always ready to spring into action through affection from other forces. Apathy signals the muting of this latent potential, someone whose affectivity is impaired and who has become unable to be affected from other beings and people. So this reading makes apathy fundamentally different from other kinds of affect, right? While the sad and angry are still affectable and can potentially be changed, the apathetic will resist influence of all kinds. Apathy in its technical form would thus count as an anti-affect, all right? And the blunting of affectivity highlights the stakes involved in apathy in capitalist culture. Not only is apathy problematic for productivity, the absence of a recognized potentializable subject of passion also makes human agency something that capitalism is unable to grasp and manipulate. So apathetic masses would disappear, as John Ballard put it, right? The passionless character of apathy inhibits its subjects from being seduced or commodified into commodifiable labor power. So I should at this point state my debt to Matthew Cole, who does this brilliant analysis of Marienthal. But he largely critiques Marienthal for his construction of work as nature and a kind of psychological need rather than income, right? Especially for male inhabitants. So in Cole, we see the shadow of the trade-off theory, right? Where, sort of passion is used as a trade-off for income, for money, okay? And so while Cole is very insightful, I intend to move beyond Cole, all right? Because ultimately in Marienthal, there was something quite unusual about the way apathy is being conceptualized, all right? So now to start in this, we have to kind of understand the specificity of apathy, a point that would make sense, right? When we sort of really understand how the sort of researchers understood it. So when we think of apathy, we normally think of this idea that this person is suffering, right? This person is languishing, is sad, but that was not the condition that Marienthal researchers found, right? And they note that despite vivid portraitures of lack, the researchers will conclude that the most common basic attitude in Merentel was not synonymous to that of desperation or depression. In fact, a lighter term, resignation, is used to convey what the researchers saw. And they defined it as a relatively calm general mood and even sporadic recurring moments of serenity and joy, right? And most resigned families continue to maintain households, care for children, and even had an overall sort of feeling of relative well-being. But they said the problem, and this is where they take apathy as its key object, right? Problem lay that they had no plans, no relation to the future. So the community essentially was surviving, its members offering help to each other, but their survival came with, quote, a reduced demand and a lack of expectation that reduced the motivation for them to find a way out of their predicament. So the moral charge of Merentel must be understood in this context, right? Unemployment was not painful in the sense that it produced sorrow or depression in a community. Any unhappiness, even if it did emerge initially, did not stay for long, and the community was able to survive despite their lack, right? But the successful adaptation to lack from the researcher's perspective presented in its own problem. In being so well adapted to lack, right? The resigned also lost the will to change things for the better, which carried dangerous consequences for the future, right? So the researchers then conclude with the message of fading resilience, right? Noting that a moment will come where shoes can no longer be mended, crockery replaced, and illness recovered from without medical attention. At the end of the process, they write, lies ruin and despair. So in this, we can see how Merentel revises the notion of what constitutes a proper adaptation to unemployment. An adaptation that might be considered ordinary, one that ends with making do with poverty and contentment despite challenges, is presented as bad, right? Where it stifles activity and is harmful for existence. This reversal from adaptation to maladaptation, or what I call maladapted adaptation, must be understood as political, a means of protecting the normative productivist order that Katie Weeks argues has been key to capitalist culture. So in Merentel, the normal productivity implies like structural continuance, with work construed as the only object that can guarantee a livable, worthwhile future, right? And that dreams of structural change, right, when the children express it, sort of criticized as as a kind of dream, as a form of dreaming, right? And these dreamers are afflicted with the same atmosphere of hopelessness that was then carried from the old to young. So apathy as such cannot be reduced to a lack of desire. In Merentel, again, a social scientific text that is key for understanding unemployment and its psychological significance, right? Apathy came to describe differences between acceptable and unacceptable desires. So the label is used to pathologize those who want wrongly, and then rationalize through a series of natural developments that will come to harm the apathetic subject. So we see this in a chapter where various technologies were used to denote the maladjustment of Merentel men to capitalist time. So they recorded the times that men stop on the street, the pace of their walk, the demarcation of their day, and they write here, quote, everything that occurs happens as if it were unintentional, right? And then the general Merentel man is then described as, quote, someone primitive and mindless, almost driven by instinct, right? Quote here, he hears some slight noise outside the streets and goes out. A moment later, the noise is forgotten. Nevertheless, he remains standing outside until some trivial impression prompts a further move. Apathy's damage is thus construed to go beyond the loss of income. It enforces the decline into an insipid, passionless life, and eventually transforms the unemployed into an animal-like object of apprehension whose presence threatens public safety. So what I want to make clear here is that Merentel has imposed a particular idea of apathy that's different from what we used to think about, right? In which apathy is understood as something that is really that leaves you disconnected from the social world. And But the sort of opposite actually is the case, right? Because what the researchers were actually concerned with was the lack of pain, the ways in which people were adapted to apathy, the calmness that came with adaptation, and the ability of people to live with the reduced circumstances of unemployment rather than rebel against it, right? So again, the apathy here measures against what is seen as the norm of capitalist life, one in which that people must engage with it with a certain kind of passionate intensity, all right? And in that way, then apathy becomes psychologically dangerous and something that must be removed at all costs. So what happens? How does apathy then, how does legacy of Merintel then starts to affect our social world? So one of the things I looked into was the ways that then policies are then functioned and built around this base understanding that Merintel created. And then we see something here quite curious, right? An attempt to prevent the maladapted adaptation that we see in Merintel. So if apathy arises because unemployment is tolerable, then measures must be put in place to make the tolerable intolerable, such that the unemployed would notice and seek to rectify their situation. Unhappiness must be inserted into unemployment so that unemployment can be made naturally unhappy, so that it cannot have the kind of contentment that is witnessed in Merintel. And we see this happening in several ways. So in 2009, during, again, a period of massive unemployment, job hunters started to notice the disturbing trend found in job ads, right? A stipulation that says only the employed need apply. Now, this is something seen as discriminatory, right? To only hire people who are employed, but it is still consistently found in regular employment circles. So economists, for instance, found that callbacks from job advertisements decreased by 4 to 6% with each month of unemployment, right? After the 6 month, industry relevant experience would cease to matter, at which point all applicants are pushed to the bottom of the barrel, rarely considered as having any useful and valuable skills. So it is tempting to chalk this up to a kind of subjective discrimination. But to do so will be to elide the ways that discrimination is orchestrated to produce a culture of compulsory employment. So I have earlier described apathy as maladapted adaptation, a label assigned to those who are too well adapted to unemployment, those who in surviving have refused to consider the necessity of employment to the futurity of one's well-being. In the late 1970s, in the United States, economists began theorizing optimal unemployment insurance, all right? So optimal unemployment insurance, basically, if you get fired or you get retrenched from your job through no fault of your own, you'll be given money, right, by the government, right? And this is unemployment insurance. So optimal unemployment insurance is an attempt to modulate that amount to avoid what they call the moral hazard of unemployment, right? So the moral hazard of unemployment basically comes to the idea that if you give people money after they're unemployed, you may unintentionally lengthen the period of unemployment, right? So optimality in this context will thus seek to reduce, quote, distortions in the benefit system, offering protection for those who become unemployed through no fault of their own, while ensuring that the unemployed are urged on to find re-employment. So to ensure the latter, these economies started to do a lot of different experiments. But the main thing they did, what they wanted to do was to punish workers for continued unemployment. All right, so you must create enough pain such that even with unemployment insurance, the jobless must rationally find it to their interest to head back to work, right? Now, again, there are many different things that economists did here. One thing that they did, for instance, was to structure the payouts so that you get more payouts and then you get less and less over time, creating the sense of urgency, right? But notice how the rational behavior of re-employment is normatively enforced here with unhappiness, right? Any possible sign of unhappiness, of happiness in unemployment needs to be made irrational and transient through the calibration of punishment. The greater the chance of the moral hazard, the more punishing unemployment needs to become. Optimality thus implies a condition of a natural drive towards re-employment, rationale that must be made airtight with the preemptive modulation of a large number of factors that could play into these decisions. And there are consequences to this, right? So these efforts would actually have an important result of suppressing the wage and reducing the bargaining power of workers. So as economists recognized early on, minimizing insurance would depress the reservation wage, the minimum wage that workers can accept for a job. All right. So the more desperate you are, the more you're willing to take a lowly paid job, right? And so over a long period, then this kind of policies would affirm corporate power at the expense of worker power. So what I've suggested here is that misery in unemployment comes as a collaborative effort in world making, loosely distributed across the social field. It is made sensible through systematic obstacles that make life progressively more difficult for the unemployed. And so one result then is that newly unemployed people would experience tremendous time pressures to find employment quickly. Not only do they have to struggle with the loss of income, loss of healthcare, knowledge that the chance of re-employment will slim over time forces applicants to anxiously hurry in their search for jobs. And again, then this would then reduce the workers' ability to bargain for wages. But also quite curiously, you will notice a kind of a weird conundrum. The more that unemployment is seen as damaging, the more that unemployment is seen as something that is negative and creating a lot of unhappiness in people, the more that workers must demonstrate a positive attitude or passion during their job hunt so that they can describe themselves as being having distance from the kind of stains of unemployment itself, right? So as one career columnist in Guardian remarks, right, being positive while being weighed down by the burden of unemployment can be difficult, but it is a vital precondition for your job search. So he goes on to say, if you feel negative or unenthusiastic, it can come across when you meet people and they wouldn't buy you. So this statement highlights the paradox of unemployment. The more that unemployment is made to cause unhappiness to spur re-employment, the more the unemployed must put distance to separate themselves from the unhappiness assumed of them, the more they must acquaint themselves with the discourses of passion or passionate work. So I go through a lot more depth, right, in this particular case, right? I pull it further along to look at all the kinds of different self-help texts that relate to passion in the present. But I hope this example illustrates the kind of core argument that I'm making here, right? Passion cannot be regarded as just an emotion that we feel, but it must be understood as something that is really structured into our world, right? And so, the idea that people are naturally invested in work, that, that people are driven by a feeling of wrongness when they're unemployed, must be understood critically as something that is collaborative produced, which is why I also call passion a world building project, right? And of course, that also then describes why I also would put forth that passionate work is this very important thing that we need to consider at this point of time, especially the moment where I think work is coming more and more into crisis with automation, inequality, and all these different kinds of issues. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Renyi. That was excellent sharing. I trust everyone in the room probably has, got the opportunity to see how, this is a unique book. Okay, I really, enjoyed going through the book quickly. I will go through it more carefully again, right? But then it's really. It's very unique with very rich materials. The one thing I really like is the just now you saw the juxtaposition of the George Clooney, okay, Up in the Air movie, contemporary text, with Marienthal, okay, from 19 years ago. So it's this kind of juxtaposition that creates not only a rich, okay, reflections, okay, and the nuanced analysis, but historicized contemporary scene, so that we see today the issues that we are struggling with. We try to analyze with the affective structure of passion, okay, actually has much deeper roots, okay, and if we say there's maybe it's not a field or a subfield, but it's working on the structure of feelings, okay, so I definitely think this is cutting edge, okay, it is a really definitive work to push, okay, the study of structure of feelings to the next level of historicized but also nuanced analysis. And one person I know, a leading scholar in studying the structure of feelings, okay, in relation to media, culture, and society, has to be Professor Tom Streeter. So I will pass the microphone over to you, and let's put our hands together first to thank Renyi and congratulations to his new book, and also welcome Professor Streeter to share some comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Jack, and Professor Hong. Congratulations on this excellent book, and I'm flattered and gratified to be able to have a chance to offer a few comments. It was interesting that it seems that some of you on the call have read a piece I published a while ago about Steve Jobs, published at the moment, the height of the kind of hagiography in the wake of his death, where he was celebrated in many parts of the world. And I gave a talk on that paper when I was working on it, a public talk somewhere. And, you know, I did parts of that paper, and I made the case that most of the celebration of Steve Jobs had very little to do with the realities of the Apple Corporation. Steve Jobs didn't actually invent any of those things he was given credit for inventing, and working for Apple is not, you know, quite the hip and wonderful thing that it was portrayed to be. Afterwards, after that talk, a man came up to me and said, "Please don't take my dreams away from me." And I chatted with this man. I talked with him a little bit, and it became clear that he was struggling. He had a few bits of work here and there, but he was experiencing the pain of precarity and underemployment. And you know, that moment left me scratching my head until I read Renyi Hong's book. Because you know, Hong offers a kind of structural explanation for exactly that response. Someone seeing something in a passionate narrative, wanting it for himself, and that either doesn't help or may even help support his precarious position towards the job market. And I think many readers of this book will have versions of my experience where you're reading it and then you remember some event or conversation from your own life, and those moments snap into focus and kind of get fleshed out because of Professor Hong's analysis. So I guess kind of what I'm saying is, what a great book. I won't repeat what I said in the blurb, but I will emphasize that it's such an intellectually committed inquiry that Professor Hong, he covers vast amounts of literature, and there's a sense of really thinking, doing the work of thinking about hard questions and making connections in the writing. He didn't kind of like work out his whole analysis and then just kind of wrap it up in a bow for us. You kind of work with him as he works through the material. And I think there's been a lot of writing that in different ways tries to talk about the complex relations between capitalism and emotions or affect, structures of feeling. But most of that work, and I'd include my own in this, most of that work tends to arrive at the question with an already worked out framework and then proceed to apply it without really talking directly about all the other ways that these questions are being addressed in literature, both in the past and present. And you know, just check out Professor Hong's very impressive bibliography, and that's just a symptom of how thoroughly he engages the broader literature. And in that sense, he's a model to us all. But at the same time, I do want to emphasize, for all his sophisticated intellectual commitment and inquiry, it resonated. It made me think of instances from my own life and the lives of people I know. The book manages to be both erudite and vivid. And that's not easy to achieve. And in particular, the book has left me thinking about all the ways that people seem to get attached to their resentments or attached to the condition of being resentful or struggling, rather than seeking ways to get out of their own predicament or seeking ways to engage with others to find ways out of their predicaments. And so this book, and this is a little different than what than passionate work actually, but the incel movement is just the most obvious version of an organized social structure that where people's lack of access to what they want, friendship, love, becomes the organizing feature and makes them then hang on to it rather than trying to actually figure out how to get friendship and love. So, and I could go on. I remember once during the 2016 election in the US, I was living in the US, and I published an op-ed. It was about Elizabeth Warren. The content doesn't matter, but it was something that attracted right-wing hate mail. This happens in the US these days to politicians, or even to just a minor op-ed thing. So I got all this mail, a lot of it handwritten letters in the mail. And there were 2 or 3 of this stack of letters where the writer, part of the thing was I was a professor and Elizabeth Warren was a professor, and these letters were written by people who kind of hate professors. And I'll say, some of us professors maybe deserve it. I don't know, but it's a thing. And I think they'd say, I'm not going to give any money to your university. That is, if I had any money, but I don't, I kind of screwed up. I'm a little, and it's like they put this in the letter to me, attacking me, and it's they're kind of laying out a position within which by their own criteria, they are failures, and they are nonetheless attracted to that position. So it's and so, to bring it back closer to passionate work, Professor Hong's core point is that passionate subjects are estranged not at the moment of influence, when they follow their passions. It's not like I'm passionate, I follow it. That's not the moment. It's when they enter into a world where suffering and passion are read a particular way. Passion is a reading of some form. And I think that's a huge insight and a very, very useful framing of it. Which is to say, he's not really criticizing somebody who gets all involved in something and throws themselves into it. It's how that moment then gets read and organized in a larger way throughout society. And, at its worst, prioritizing passionate work can lead to a situation. One of them, Professor Hong points out to in his conclusion, it can support untenable, inhumane working conditions, as was the case with the celebrations of essential workers, at least in North America, during the worst of the pandemic. And they said, oh, these people are heroic and enduring and helping us all. And these were like Amazon warehouse workers who had no choice but to go to work in Amazon warehouses that, at least in Ontario, they didn't get good protection from the virus and got the virus at higher levels, sometimes fatally. And we were then cheering them on rather than saying these working conditions are inhumane. Now, Hong does point towards a way out of this. The affective structure of passionate work, he argues, naturalizes passion as a want. as it frames it as something that workers want for themselves. Whereas, as Hong puts it, you need to make visible the social interests of our attachments. Passion has been many different things in history. We need to acknowledge that and the possibilities that come with it. We need to acknowledge the contingency of passion as we experience it now, the historical contingency. And this gives us a chance, a glimpse anyway, of the possibility of expanding the repertoire of what it means to be affected and to affect. So he's, along the same line, he makes the point that passions are not wholly interior, they're social. And because passion is multiple, ambivalent, and social, and historically contingent, he argues, and these are his words, we need to have a willingness to live with the ambivalences of passion, to make space for the absence of passion. I've heard this phrase by other people is, we need to let ourselves, and certainly need to let others around us, sit with our moments of exhaustion, sit with our depletion. Let that be real to us, rather than saying, okay, I'm kind of exhausted, but I need to get involved. I need to find a way to keep going. It's, at first that doesn't sound like a politically radical act, but the more I've thought about it and the more I read Professor Hong's book, the more persuaded I was. Now, to wrap up, I have a few questions, if it's okay for Professor Hong, and perhaps it may work if others want to also chime in response. So first question is a scholarly one. How do we continue our scholarly discussion about the emotional organization of capitalism? Because it is a bit fragmented. There are so many terms: structures of feeling, affect, passion, romanticism, authenticity, soulfulness, cruel optimism, and more. There's a great book by Colin Campbell, a Weberian sociologist, titled The Romantic Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. But he goes on in the book, good Weberian that he is, to refine his terminology and to elaborate it into what he calls not romanticism, but modern, autonomous, imaginative hedonism. And, that's a tendency. We get into these debates and we sort of break it down into more fine-grained language. And there's excellent intellectual reasons and sometimes a need to do that. But I wonder if then the conversation, as everybody kind of develops their own peculiar take on it, it's hard to kind of unify the discussion. And I'm wondering if you think there's some things we could do to better unify the discussion. And particularly, and this may be too much to ask, but these days, I think, ways to make our arguments accessible outside academia. How are we going to tell our students, people out, our politicians in some societies and so forth, what kind of language can we create about rethinking this, that passionate work is not an unquestioned good? A second question concerns the relationship of passionate work to other discourses. At any given moment in history, there are multiple available discourses about how people understand themselves and their relationship to the world. And these different discourses interact. One point, when Steve Jobs was at the height of his popularity, Bill Gates said, I don't know, I think a person should go out and make money first. And once they've made a lot of money, they can worry about the meaning of life. And Bill Gates is a much more classical, well, he is a neoliberal, but he's providing another discourse, which is go out, make a profit. That's your job. Don't worry about what you feel about it. Overcome your feelings, suppress your feelings, really, to go out and make a profit and buy and sell in the marketplace. So there's other discourses like just work hard and get rewarded. And that has its own implications. If the work hard and you will get rewarded implies that if you're not rich, it's your fault, which is not true, of course. But so I'm not saying that these other discourses are better. I think they may exist in interaction with passionate work at times. And so that's the second question. What about other discourses that bump into passionate work? And third, what do we make of what I've heard called the Great Resignation? There's both a growing labor movement in some parts of the world, particularly in North America. There's kind of been well, in the US, there's been a bit of a turnaround with regards to labor unions, but there's also a measurable and immeasurably increasing number of people in the US and I think some other parts of the world who are refusing to work for low wages. They said, I'd rather not work. Are refusing to work long hours. I'd rather not be passionate about my work. I'll show up and do the minimum and go home. And this is it's creating something of a crisis amongst corporate management. And what do we make of that? Is that the emergence of something else? Is that just a kind of predictable response of the pushing of passionate work so hard in the past? So anyway, I'll offer those as questions for everybody, but probably Professor Hong should be given first chance to try to answer them.
Yes, thank you, Tom. That was excellent and wonderful comments and questions. So Renyi, please respond, first, and then the floor will be open and you can type, the audiences can type in the dialog box, and then we will answer them after Renyi takes his first chance, please.
Right. Thanks for this wonderful response, Tom. I think you said a lot of things that I didn't see in my own book too. So thanks a lot for that. Yeah, I think those are really important questions, and they are really huge questions too, right? I probably start with the easiest one, I guess, right? How do we think about the Great Resignation? So indeed, when I heard of, I think Great Resignation is a very complex sort of reaction, right? It is a reaction, I guess it is, I wouldn't call it anti-work reaction per se, but definitely it is a moment of time where people are trying to claim autonomy over the conditions of their work. But I think if you look at the Great Resignation, that there are still a lot of couple of problems, right? So why did the Great Resignation come about? It came about because of the pandemic on the stimulus checks, right? That was one of the big main reasons in which people were allowed to have time to even resign and reconsider their lives, right? And I think it goes back to the whole argument about optimal unemployment insurance, right? Because of the history of making people desperate, right? People just didn't have a chance to really think about their work. And so when now they have a breathing space, they are willing to accept different conditions for their work. So I think that's one positive thing. But at the same time, then we see a sort of reaction against it, right? So the Great Resignation has also been people criticizing for being called a great laziness, right? And now Great Resignation is morphing into another term called the Great Regret, So again, you see that the imposition to have attachment to work continues to be there, right? And I guess my whole argument of passionate work is not that you can detach, right? But as long as structures are there, you are forced back in. And there are, again, forces always pushing us to have a certain kind of attachment to work. And that, again, to carve out that breathing space is so precious and so difficult. So while I think that, I think these movements are really important. But I think within those moments, you see also the kind of antagonism going around, right? Because of what people think work should be and how people should relate to work, right? I guess that relates in some ways to our scholarly discussions of capitalism. I mean, I do see what you mean in the sense that there are a lot of words, a lot of concepts coming out. And I guess, when people, I guess it's also academic culture, right? There is a need to sort of create your own terminology, right? To create your own catchphrase. I think that good work ultimately has to follow a genealogy, right? And I think one of the things I like about doing passionate work as a book, right, is that I'm given the space to just write, right, and to then trace ideas outwards, right, and I find that rewarding, right? I mean, so while the goal is, of course, in academia is to create that concept that illuminates, right? I think the tracing the conceptual significance and concepts along the way really help enrich the concepts that you eventually come up with, but also it's just eye-opening, right? It just leads you to think about your ideas in a whole lot of different ways. And this is why I always go back to history when I'm stuck with trying to study something in the present, because I feel like just looking back in the past really helps us come into contact with different significance around the ideas that we are investigating with. And of course your work has done a lot of that. So I think that is what scholarship should do, right? I guess the question is as well is with passionate work and its relationship to other discourses. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I can't say the passionate work is an effective structure that covers everything, right? But if we see passionate work as in a minimal description, as a description of attachment that enforces energeticity, right? So one of the reasons why I chose passion as this key word is because passion is an energetic effect, right? It's something that spurs movement. So whether or not you feel happy, or it's not just about feeling, right? It's about acting, right? Because passion is an intense emotion. So if we see passion also as this quality of acting, then I think that you can see how this idea of attachment starts moving along and mutating into many different other kinds of advice, right? So for instance, don't, like you mentioned with Bill Gates, right? Don't worry too much about feelings, just do it, right? Doing, I think, is the perfect enactment of passion. Doing without caring about your own guilt, for instance, is also the perfect enactment of passion, right? Passion being a state that you live with and feel strongly about, that allows you to forgo and forget others around you and what your actions can do. That is a quality of passion. So I mean, again, right, so this is risky because this means passion can apply to every single thing. But I guess, and I don't really need, my goal is not really to use that word and then say, oh, you take that word and just run and characterize everything. That's not what my goal is. I guess my goal is then to just use passionate work as a way for us to then really sort of think through work, right? Think through how we are working and the kind of transactions we have with work, especially at moments when you say ironically that we should feel disappointed. Then how do when it comes about that we start where we feel the ability to continue on? So I hope I answered your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Renyi. So the floor is open, and you can type your question in the dialog box anytime, okay, about this book or anything that was discussed, okay? Maybe while we wait, I will fill in the time and to share some comments, right? And I think the first and second question from Tom are both very big questions, all right? It's talking about the whole field, to unify, the first question about unifying the various theories and concepts. Okay, I think what Tom was asking is an effort to get a meta discourse, right? So rather than just going deeper and deeper on different directions, but people can come back, right, to because about the emotional, okay, affective dimensions, so that there can be more commonality in that academic field, and then the connections between passionate work and other kind of discourses also is about, okay, it's more of an empirical question, right? But still, okay, it's about how things, how can there be a larger picture, right? So my personal feeling, I don't have answer, okay, but my personal feeling is, okay, I will be something like old Marxist, all right? It's like the the historical materialism. Okay, so when things are changing globally, okay, I think Renyi did an excellent job to talk about the different economic, okay, recession, right, the depression, all those the economic moments. But maybe at other times, I can imagine if people in Europe now, especially eastern part of Europe, okay, when they discuss this, it could be quite different compared to a year ago before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Right, so there could also be political moments, okay, and of course in Singapore, okay, even though we are in a relatively more peaceful, okay, place, but then the worries about impending conflicts, okay, we could hear that from Prime Minister Li Qianlong's talk, okay, last month, right? So I think there can be other, so the materialist, political and economic thing on the ground may have regional, characteristics, but at the same time, I think Tom's point, third question about the Great Resignation is not reserved to the West, right? In Asia, for example, in China now, CNA had a very good analysis about the Tangping, the lying flat. But now it's not just lying flat. Lying flat is the Chinese version of the Great Resignation. But now the latest CNA documentary is about Bailan, is let it rot. It's even worse, I think, than Tangping is like a more active, okay, apathetic. That is, the Bailan, the let it rot, okay, sentiment is quite close to apathy. So there's something also global, I think, that we can continue to discuss. Inspired by this book and today's discussion. So now we have a question from Victor Zhuang. Okay, so really love the book, so please buy the book. I know you are now working on your second book project. Okay, and I wonder if you could share how your first book is influencing how you are thinking about the second project and the linkages between the two.
Right. And thanks, Victor, for that question. So yes, I'm working on my second book project now, and I'm tentatively calling it Bearable Media. So my question that animates, I think, both books, right, is this question of what does work do, right? What does work legitimate? How does work attach us to the social world, right? And it's basically an exploration of the ways in which work is construed within our societies. In this first book, of course, I look at passion as its effective structure, right? At this idea of fulfillment, that's goes all the way back to Abraham Maslow, for instance, right? And I was able to bring that out. In the second book, Bearable Media, I'm more interested to look at the ways in which work is used to ensure the continuance of privilege, right? For those who are racially and class privileged. Okay, so and I'm looking at, for instance, specific trends around work, like for instance with telecommuting, right? Some of these trends around work were largely sort of described as just an emergent trend, okay? But when I was looking through history around these terms, I saw that much of these, for instance, telecommuting was also used to protect white families in a moment where there was crisis around the idea of the suburban crisis, right? So the fears of their children going wayward, the fears of precarity, and how then sustainability or work-life balance can be used to balance out the kind of instabilities happening in the workplace, right? So for me then, Bearable Media, the second part of my book project, which I'm still working on, is a sort of a thinking through of why is it so hard to detach ourselves from work, right? So if the hypothesis that if work is a site, not only site of exploitation as you usually think about it from a Marxian sense, but if work is a site that protects certain populations, then it makes it doubly hard to get out of it, because we are in that history of that work has always been used at certain points to give us a condition of life, right? And this, of course, then explains why detaching from work becomes so difficult, even if you are no longer experiencing those kinds of gains from work, right? So that is the sort of the thread I'm trying to disentangle in my second book, right? Walking through different trends of work that comes in at when digital computing came in, right? Remote work, telecommuting, things like that, and during the early historical phases, and so thinking about their relationship to the present. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Renyi. Yeah, one thing when I went through the book again quickly, I was looking for discussion because, okay, some of you may know I'm still relatively new to Singapore. I've only been here for a little more than 2 years, so I was also looking for discussion about Singapore, but then there was not so much. All right, but then I want to use this to echo what Tom said. Okay. Actually, when I was reading into the book, okay, if you just look for Singapore, okay, there were no specific, but then there's so many things that relates to what I observe, okay, in Singapore. Okay, let me just share one moment, okay. Maybe in a way, it echoes what Tom said about, Steve Jobs, okay, admirer talking to you. This was 2 months ago. Actually, Renyi and we were doing a focus group among gig workers in Singapore. And then, so this was in a union space, right? So we had 6 food delivery persons. They were all Singaporean, sitting around the table. And Renyi was actually moderating. And while other people were saying, oh, I'm doing this because I can make more money, or I like doing food delivery. Okay, I like riding my bicycle. I feel passionate, essentially. They were saying like, one guy actually said, we do this because we are social rejects. I don't remember, I don't know whether Renyi, remember at that moment. At that moment really struck me. Okay, so this is like another moment, like Tom said, the book, the analysis resonates with our, so the book is both erudite and vivid, right? So even though it does not specifically talk about Singapore, but if you look into workers or underemployed or unemployed, okay, retrenched workers, as we call them in Singapore, okay, there are so many flashbacks, okay, like this. When I was rethinking about that, the person, okay, used to be, I think, a relatively successful banker, but then because one of his children, okay, need long-term care, he has to go to food delivery, all right? And then he did not feel ashamed to speak out, in front of a whole room of other people who were displaying their positive passion. But he's saying, we are social rejects, right? When I was leaving the room, Renyi was still talking to him, right? And so I think there are something fundamental, right? So that is really a major success. Is, what is success of the book is we can use them, right, in the contemporary Singaporean setting, and I'm sure in other places. Okay, the insights are relevant. They resonate tremendously in a critical light. And with that, I also want to echo, Tom, he said this is such a a wonderful book. Yeah. We may have maybe a few minutes left. Any? I think there are some of our students. Usually, students are a bit shy in NUS, but this is not. There's no right or wrong question. Oh, we have another one. Okay. Well, now questions suddenly all come in. Well, 3 of them. We have maybe we will have to go a little bit beyond time now. Let's just try to answer these 3 questions. Chen, all right, is asking. Maybe we can all read. Okay, about Chen is also saying resonates. with the book's discussion, and also about creativity. Is perceived on intellectual property currency, emphasizing productivity. May I ask if you see a connection of decolonizing passion?
Yeah, thanks, Chang. I mean, I think those are really great question. I mean, I think passion versus laziness, I think there is certainly a historical genealogy to laziness, right? I think that is worthwhile thinking about, right? About why laziness becomes reviled, right? And how the opposite of laziness, right? Activity and passion sort of becomes the dominant ideology today. And I think that again relates back to what I think Jack talked about, that's going on with a lot of reactions to work today, right? So there's a Tangping in China, but there's also the let rot. I don't know what's the Chinese version of that. Bailan, okay, yeah, the Bailan, right? And I think that it is about reclaiming. Okay, so I mean, I don't know fully about that those two movements, right? But I can see it also as a way of trying to create the alternative space, right, outside passion. I think the challenge is that when passion becomes so normative, then these other spaces then become just degenerative, right? And I don't mean just degenerative from the sense of state repression, state apparatuses, repressive state apparatuses, but I mean that I worry that it becomes hard to think of anything useful about these states other than just I'm letting myself rot, and so I think there is an important reason why I think we need to reclaim some of these possibilities and give space to some of these possibilities and these states, right, without necessarily judging them right off the bat. Decolonizing passion, I think that is a very important. I mean, I don't really do that in my work, right? But passion is, as far as I see it, a predominantly white emotion. It's a very middle-class white kind of state, right? That, I mean, if you look at the history of labor, especially with settler colonies and things like that, workers are understood closer to animals, right? And in that history, then in the colonial history, then there is no real passion to be thought about. Only the colonizers have passions, right? And then will not be recognized as abstract labor, but as labor that has individuality and uniqueness. So I think there's something there. But yeah, it's a good question. I didn't think too much about that. But thanks for that question. More to think about.
Thanks, Renyi. Next, let's just take a couple minutes to answer each question. All right. Looks like we have another Marxist in the room, and Renyi Hong is asking about class analysis. Okay, what do you think about the connections between different classed subjects, construction workers or Grab drivers, make the passionate work of white-collar workers possible? Do you agree with this dynamic or something to add to?
I mean, definitely, right? So construction workers, Grab drivers, Grab of course is the sort of Uber variant in Singapore, right? And of course they give time and they give emotional space as well to and they give infrastructure to much of the kinds of things that we see normatively as being able to create passion. But I also want to emphasize that these workers are subject themselves to passion discourses, right? I think for Grab especially, it is very clear that these workers, even though they are not within that sort of core group of people, they are subject to, this idea of, loving your company and working excitedly about your companies, even for construction workers, right? I mean, there are movements that sort of celebrate this poetry and all these things, which is not always a bad thing. But I think again, like what does that framing intend to do, and how then passion is seen as a recuperative emotion, I think then becomes something that we should consider as well. Thanks, Renyi.
All right, thanks,
So-
Renyi. Our last question and comes from PhD students, okay, Chen Changwen, who is in the middle of writing his dissertation. I think he is also thinking about transforming his dissertation into a book. Do you have any tips for a student at this stage?
Wow, a book is a tough thing to write. I think for anybody, right? I think, you know, when I wrote my dissertation, I wrote it akin to a book, and I think that helped a bit. But I would say that that doesn't work for everybody. And I think that the really important thing, I think, is to do a good dissertation, right? Because then that transformation is easier and more possible. The most challenging thing about, I think, doing a dissertation is that true thread, you know, sorry, not dissertation, for a book, right? How do you make a story that connects the dots? And you know, as Tom said, I write in a particular way, right? So I kind of really massage each topic, and then move from one topic to the other. But then you know, so I had to do that work of connecting the dots. And I think if you could, when you write your dissertation, if you think about how the dots connect, how the chapters connect, it will be much easier then to take that dissertation and make it into a book project at a later stage. Yeah, so that's my brief advice.
And also, don't just think about being passionate about the work. You can also take other, yeah, there are other
Yes.
better and other alternatives. Yeah, and remember during your dissertation writing, take your breaks seriously, right? Don't exploit your body, you know, too much. That's something that I think I would also suggest. Yeah. All right, I think we have already gone a little bit over time. I know several of us need to go to another meeting at 11. And also it's getting quite late over there, okay, for Tom. And I see other friends from East Coast of the US as well. So we probably should end it here, and let's put our hands together. Congratulations to Renyi for such a wonderful book. Please buy it, read it, cite it, and use it, okay, in your future, okay, work. And also, even though you are thinking about your own future developments, okay, I think there are lots of insight from this book that all of us can use. And thank you so much, Tom, for your wonderful comments. I think we can write what you just said. The transcript can become a letter for, like, a recommendation for nomination letter for this book for some awards. Yeah, you said something really profound and impressive. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Yes, well, and
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you for the opportunity. So cool.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, goodbye. And for people who are getting late, good night. For others, have a wonderful Friday ahead. Bye.
Bye-bye.